Hey, it's Jay, and I want to show you how to plan a fun family trip in Portugal. Okay, so let's get into it. First thing I did was sit down and just research the country and figured out where we wanted to go. We traveled in March over the kids' spring break. The weather this time of year ranges from the 40s to the 70s, so we kind of just dressed in layers and peeled them off as the day went on. We did get some rain the first couple of days, but the rest of the trip was absolutely beautiful. We flew from Jacksonville, Florida to Philadelphia and then over to Lisbon. The flight time from Philly to Lisbon was about 6.5 hours. We had a reservation for a rental car at the Lisbon airport because we wanted to have the freedom to go where we wanted to go. Our rental ended up being great, but we came off the plane extremely jet lagged, and the sales agent behind the 6th counter really took advantage of me when I was tired. He was definitely a smooth talker. By the time we finished, I had at least tripled the cost of the rental car. I wasn't too happy. I shook it off quickly though once I saw how beautiful the city of Lisbon is. We drove downtown and parked directly below Praça Luís de Camões. Luís was an epic poet in the 16th century and he's honored in this square. We dropped our luggage off at the front desk of our hotel and just explored neighborhoods such as Barrio Alto, Baixo, Chiado, and Alfama. We stopped in a place called Livraria Bertrandi, and it's the oldest operating bookstore in the world, opened in 1732. One thing you have to try is the país de nata, which is an egg custard pastry with a touch of cinnamon. They were really good, and there's shops all over the city that sell them. We visited Carmo Convent, which is a medieval 15th century convent cathedral that was destroyed during the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. It literally brought the roof down. Most of the buildings in the area are from after 1755 because it was really devastating to the city. Carmo Convent had some really neat relics to look at as well. I'd say it's worth the visit. We really enjoyed exploring. We strolled down Rua Augusta, which is a tiled street that has tons of shops and cafes and restaurants. It's just very lively with people. From there, we headed to Praça de Comércio, which is probably one of the most famous squares in all of Europe. It's certainly one of the largest. It used to be the place of a royal palace until the 1755 earthquake. When the city was rebuilt, the palace was remodeled as part of the downtown Lisbon area, ordered by Portuguese King Jose I. His statue is in the center of the plaza. He's symbolically crushing snakes with his horse as he walks down the path. We climbed up the hill to Castelo de São Jorge. This castle is just super interesting. It has a ton of history. There's archaeological evidence that people have lived here since the 8th century BC. And then the oldest parts of the castle date back to the 2nd century BC. It's been rebuilt and built upon, but one of the coolest things is that it has this amazing view of the city. And peacocks walking all around the grounds.
Oh my gosh, take pictures of the peacock.
Wow. That night we had an early dinner and then we just crashed to try to sleep off our jet lag. But our hotel apartment right in the middle of downtown was actually really nice. I'd definitely stay there again. After a nice breakfast at the hotel, a quick family photo on a scenic street, and a short hike back to our rental car, we were on the road. We headed from Lisbon over to Sintra. The roads in Sintra are very confusing. Some are one way, and others are just very congested with tourists. We wanted to visit Castelo dos Moros and the Peña Palace, but it seemed impossible to drive directly to either one. So we parked in a little town below just east of these sites, and they had like a really nice hike on these ancient cobble roads all the way up to the castle. The Moorish castle is sometimes called the European Wall of China. It was built in the 8th and 9th century by the Moors to protect their crops from invaders. The Moors gave the Christians Sintra in 1031 as a good gesture, but another Muslim group, the Almoravid, basically took it by force immediately. In 1147, forces led by Alfonso Henriques, the first king of Portugal, took over Lisbon, and then the Moors just voluntarily gave up the castle to the Christian forces. There was a cool sister in there. Hello! And the views were absolutely spectacular. From there, we just caught the trail again and hiked up to the Peña Palace. During the Middle Ages, Peña Palace was a monastery that contained a beautiful chapel that has works of marble and alabaster. The 1755 earthquake wiped out the monastery, but the chapel stood strong. In 1838, King Ferdinand II acquired the old monastery, all the surrounding lands, and the castle of the Moors. He decided to build a beautiful palace to be his summer retreat, and that today is Penna Palace. After touring the castle both inside and out, we grabbed a taxi back to our car and drove up to Óbidos, or as locals say, Óbidos. This area of Portugal has been settled for thousands of years. They found evidence of early Celtic tribes. Then this area became the center of trade for the Phoenicians, and then the Romans. There were actually Roman baths in this town. They excavated and found them. Then the Moors. Then it went through medieval fortification, and now it's just an absolutely awesome little village. When we arrived, there was a chocolate festival going on. So as we walked down the streets, all the shop vendors had these little chocolate cups filled with a cherry cordial. And for €1, you could just get a little taste of the cherry cordial and then eat the chocolate cup after. It was pretty cool. We walked the streets, we tried the local beer, and then we ate dinner right in town at a place called Maddox. The food was absolutely delicious, and the service was phenomenal.
Here we go. Whoa, that's so nice.
After dinner, we drove to our apartment for the night, which happened to be just south of Nazaré, right on the western coast of Portugal. We could see the ocean right across the street. The place is called Silverside Holiday, and it was really nice. Very spacious, very clean, and then breakfast was included in the morning. The next morning, after a good breakfast, we went right across the street and just checked out the ocean. The wind was absolutely insane. From there, we headed to Tomar, which is the home of the Knights Templar in Portugal. We even got to meet one. The Convent of Christ and Castle of Tomar was founded in 1160 by the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar answered to the Pope, and their main objective was to create safe passageways for Christians to make it down to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage. The Covenant centerpiece is its 12th century rotunda, the oratory of the Templars. It was built by Gualdin Pais, the first great master of the Templars, and is one of few Templar architectures left in Europe. In 1312, the Templars were disbanded on order by the Pope and replaced with the Order of Christ in Portugal. Some say the Knights Templar had a lot of money and went underground, and still exists amongst us today. If you're in the Knights Templar, leave me a comment. I'll keep it on the down low. From there, we headed north and had a quick lunch in Coimbra. We then drove to a trailhead called Passagivos do Paiva, which means Paiva walkways. We did about 5 miles of hiking on wooden walkways. It was really cool. We actually parked, let's say, down there. You can't see it, but
At the water level.
yeah, it's at the water level. We pick up the trail. We've come all the way up here. You're on one side of the canyon looking down at the Paiva River, and you walk all the way up to a pedestrian suspension bridge. But we unfortunately arrived too late in the day and the suspension bridge was closed. If you want to hike across it, you got to get there early, and sometimes get a reservation days in advance. From there, we drove a little over an hour all the way to Porto. We checked into our apartment. We ate at a place just around the corner called Honest Greens. After a long day, it was the perfect meal, and we just enjoyed walking around the streets after dinner. We were in Porto for 2 nights, so the next day, we spent the entire day exploring the city. It was honestly the perfect day. We started off by discovering a market just around the corner from our apartment, and then we went to Esquire Coffee for breakfast. It may have been the best breakfast we had on the whole trip. Well, they were all really good. Porto is another city with such a rich history. The Proto-Celtics are the first known inhabitants of the area back in 8th century BC. But the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Muslims, the Christians have all shaped the culture and the history. It's nearly impossible to do Porto in just a day, but I'm going to show you the places that we went to, and everywhere we went we really enjoyed. After breakfast, we headed over to the Clérigos Tower, which is a tower connected to a cathedral built in 1753. It just gives you amazing 360-degree views of the city. We then walked 1 block and visited a store called Livraria Lello. It's an old famous bookstore that supposedly inspired J.K. Rowling. This place is really cashing in on it though, because they charge €8 a person. So for my family, it cost us €40 just to walk in the door. It was a beautiful place, but it probably wasn't worth worth €40. Next to the bookstore is a cathedral, Igreja do Carmo. We took some pictures of the beautiful Porto tiles that were on the outside of the cathedral. From there we walked due south to Miradouro da Vitória, which is just a little square that overlooks the Douro River and is good for some family photos. During our walk towards the river, we were passing by all these shops. So one of the notable ones was Klaus Porto. It's a shop that opened in the 1880s, and they make perfumes and soaps. The people there were very, very nice. I highly recommend stopping in and saying hello. We eventually made it down to the Douro River, and we walked along Cais de Évora, which is a famous street that just parallels the river. There's shops, there's restaurants, there's lots of street artists, and beautiful views. In fact, there was one street artist who took our photo, and she printed this out for us within seconds. We were pretty impressed, so we decided to give her a couple euro, and she did another photo for us. We crossed the Douro River using Louis I Bridge, because I'd read online that there was a park on the other side of the river with insane views of the city called Jardim do Moro. After a ton of photos and video, we headed back across the bridge, but on the upper level, there's actually two levels, lower and upper. And we went to the Porto Cathedral. This cathedral started in 1110 and wasn't completed until 1737. So that's over 600 years of construction. The cathedral is really fun to explore, and it also had really good views at the top. We continued north and stopped in Chocolataria Ecuador, which was a delicious chocolate shop and made a really nice snack. We almost returned to our apartment, but decided to go back to the market we had visited in the morning. At Mercado do Bollo, we tried cheese, fruit, olives, and Dana and I tried a bunch of the local wines, including Vinho Verde, which is a white wine made from green grapes. It's slightly carbonated, but has a really good flavor. Vinho Verde translates to green wine. The next morning we packed up and headed out fairly early to Guimarães, which is considered the birthplace of Portugal. Alfonso Henriques, the first king of Portugal, was born here, and in 1128 the Battle of Salmameche was fought in this area, which is considered the seminal event for the foundation of the Kingdom of Portugal. While walking around town, there's a bunch of medieval squares to explore. We happened to grab breakfast at Oscar's Cafe off of one of the main squares. Remember when I said the breakfast in Porto was the best one? Well, this might have been the best one. The food was so rich and flavorful, I actually splurged and got a hot chocolate that was so thick that I had to eat it with a spoon. From there, we explored town and then walked up to Palace Duques de Bragança. It's a pretty grand palace built by a French architect in the 1400s. For hundreds of years, it hosted the Duke of Bragança, but in the late 1600s, the whole palace fell into disrepair. It wasn't until the 1930s that the entire palace was restored to its original form. Immediately next door, we visited the Castle of Guimarães, which was built in the 900s to protect the monastery in the village from the Moors and the Norsemen. The castle was expanded, and Alfonso Henriques was born in the castle in 1111. It also became his lifetime residence, making the castle the royal residence of Portugal. We then drove a few miles out of the city up to Pena Mountain, which has been a Christian sanctuary and a vacation retreat for centuries. There are large boulders, forested areas, and kilometers of paths to explore, all while getting a good view of Guimarães down below. From there we drove to Amarante, which is a town known for its stone bridge built across a river in the 12th century. At the time, the bridge was considered a miracle, and the architect Concala was granted sainthood for completing this bridge. We just stopped for a snack and checked out the river and bridge while we were there, and then we were on our way to the heart of the Douro Valley, aka the Napa Valley of Portugal. Just driving into this area was so cool. It's very mountainous, and the hillsides are all covered with tiered vineyards. We stayed at Castelo dos Capelinhos, and they make really good wine. This visit was definitely one of the highlights of our entire trip to Portugal. From the moment we arrived, we were greeted with such kindness from our host Miguel. The entire property is surrounded by terraced vineyards, and the sunset was just incredible. The kids got to run around, play some soccer.
Woo! Go!
Dana and I sampled wines, and Miguel educated us about the entire process of how they make their wines.
20 persons, okay, smashing the grapes with the feet, okay? Inside of this,
we then moved into a really cozy room and enjoyed a home-cooked meal that could have been served in a Michelin star restaurant.
A baked apple with a raisin sauce,
And this is one
and a
of
paired port wine. The next morning, we took a nice hike through the vineyard. And picked some fresh fruit from the lemon and orange trees. Miguel was there early to make sure that we had everything we needed. We ate another delicious breakfast, and then we were sadly on our way. Dana and I said we'd go back in a heartbeat. This was our longest day of driving on the whole trip. It was 5 to 6 hours total, but we made a bunch of stops which really broke up the drive. We headed east and had such a scenic drive along the Douro River. Miguel had recommended that we stop in this little town called Pinho for photos and great views. Next, we drove a couple of hours and stopped in the Sabugal Castle. This was pretty cool because it was a self-guided tour. The castle was built by a young Portugal in the 1100s to keep the Moors out, and later the Castilians, as it's very close to the border of Spain. Many additions and restorations have been done on the castle, making it one of the best preserved castles in all of Portugal. In 1811, during the Third French invasion of the Napoleonic Wars, the Portuguese and British troops settled here to prepare for the attacks against the French army. From there, we drove 20 minutes over to Sortelha, which is a fortified medieval town established in 1228. It's likely that the castle and town were built on old Roman ruins because of the location and elevation. Now the castle itself is classified as a national monument. We visited on a weekday, so the town was pretty quiet. It was just neat to explore the cobblestone streets, explore the castle, and check out the views. Also, for the first time in our trip, we ran into people who didn't speak a word of English. It took some charades, but we made it work. We had a very late lunch just outside of town, and we were on our way to where we were staying for the night at Convento da Provença. This place was really cool. The small 9-room hotel was built right next to the ruins of a 12th century monastery. We were literally able to explore history right outside our hotel window. The hotel is owned by a very nice German family, and they made us feel so welcome. If you visit, make sure you check out the antiquities collection in the lobby. I was really impressed. That night, on the recommendation of the German family, we went to a really nice small local restaurant called Café Restaurante Tapada do Poejo, which was a full-service restaurant on the first floor of Sweet Maria's house. Turns out she didn't speak a word of English either, but she did speak some Spanish because we were so close to the Spanish border. Communication was a little rough, but she cooked us an awesome meal. The next morning, breakfast was included, and we were off to Marvão. Many different groups of people have called this land their own for the last 6,000 years. This area has one of the densest clusters of megalithic sites in all of Europe. Those are the stone structures you see in Outlander that Claire uses to time travel, or Stonehenge in England is also considered megalithic. Marvão sits on top of a hill, and from its castle you can see 360 degrees. It's great for spotting intruders coming in from Spain. There's evidence that the Romans had this hill fortified, but the castle of Marvão was built in the 8th century. We explored the medieval streets for a little while. Then we picked up a trailhead that led down to a little village called Portagem. The trail happened to be an ancient road made with detailed stonework. The locals are fairly certain that this was built by the Romans and maintained through the centuries. This was a 4-mile round-trip hike. This was one of my favorite moments of the trip because there were so many interesting things to look at while we were walking. These are cork trees, and they take the bark, they use it to make things, and then they mark the tree. It takes the tree 9 years to recover. Once we hiked back up to Marvão, we had lunch in town, and then we explored the municipal museum and the castle. The scenic views were absolutely incredible. Nobel Prize-winning author José Saramago wrote of the village, "From Marvão one can see the entire land. It is understandable that from this place, high up in the keep at Marvão Castle, visitors may respectfully murmur, 'How great is the world.'" Oh, and the castle had a really cool cistern. Just check out these acoustics. From there, we headed towards Evora, but on the way we took a detour into the town of Elvas.
We unfortunately didn't have time to explore the town, but the reason we stopped in is because of its aqueduct. Modeled after Roman architecture, in the late 15th century, the city found itself without any potable water, so they undertook this massive project to bring clean drinking water to the people. The only challenge was over the next century, the Castilians kept attacking. The people of Elvas kept having to spend their funds on fortification, and many times the aqueduct project was abandoned because there was just no funds for it. The first water didn't reach Elvas via the aqueduct until 1620, over 120 years after the project had been proposed. You can park right at the base of the tallest section of the aqueduct and just admire this impressive engineering. That night we stayed in Évora. After checking into our apartment for the night, we started to walk the streets. This is another walled medieval city with so much history. In fact, in the city center, there's a Roman temple, the Temple of Diana, built in the 1st century AD. The massive cathedral was built in the 13th century, but it wasn't until the 15th century that kings started to live here. Royal palaces started to spring up everywhere, and Evora's golden age began at that time. We were lucky enough to stumble upon a restaurant called Taberna Tipica Corta Feira, which normally we would have walked right by, but saw on Google that it had great reviews. The experience was phenomenal, and the food was delicious. There's only one condition. You get invited in, there is no menu, and you have to at least try every course they serve you. Oh, and there's like 20 courses. They recommend wines that pair well with your meal, and I recommend reservations because the place is small, and we were just so lucky to get the final available table without a reservation.
It's an icy mojito.
Mine is.
The next morning we got up and continued to explore town. We saw Roman house ruins, but the one really cool thing was the Capella dos Ossos. The chapel was built in the 17th century on the initiative of 3 Franciscan friars. All the walls of the chapel are completely covered in human bones. The purpose was to convey the message of temporariness and fragility of human life. There's a message at the entrance of the chapel that reads, "We bones that are here, for yours we wait." We left the city and drove west to visit Almendres Cromaleki, which is the largest existing group of structured menhirs in the Iberian Peninsula, and one of the largest in Europe. This megalithic structure of standing stones is thought to have been around since 6000 BC. Many of the stones are engraved with Neolithic drawings. Unfortunately, they're doing some temporary renovation work, so we weren't able to walk around the stones, but we still got a pretty good view from behind the fence.
Hey, buddy.
We then headed south to the southern coast of Portugal and stayed in a town called Carvoeiro. It's known to have one of the best beaches in the Algarve region, but that's not why we went there. We went to hike and explore the coast. We wanted to do the 7 Hanging Valleys hike, which was just east of where we were staying, but by the time we got there it was late afternoon, and we decided to pick up the closest trailhead only a mile away. It turned out to be awesome. All you do is show up the Carvoeiro beach and hang a left up the hill. There's a wooden walkway for about a half a mile, and then it just becomes a rocky trail that hugs the coast with epic views of the cliffs and the ocean.
Caleb, watch out!
After our hike and watching the sunset, we ate dinner right in town, crashed at our nice apartment for the night, and then ate breakfast in town again the next morning. This day was solely dedicated to just exploring the coast. We stopped in Praia do Teiro, Pontal da Carapatera, Praia da Podera, and a few other places on our way up to Baía Monte Vistoso. Enjoy this little montage of our day.
I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.
That night we stayed at Casa da Ira and had a good dinner at the Riverside pub. The next morning we had some nice breakfast at the hotel, and then I was assaulted by Ronaldo. Actually, 3 of them.
Ronaldo, no! Ronaldo.
We were on our way back to Lisbon, but the gentleman behind the hotel counter gave us a few really cool suggestions. He said we should stop and see Pessegueiro Island, and instead of driving around the bay, we should take the car ferry across the bay. So that's exactly what we did. Pessegueiro features 2 forts that were built in the 16th century by the Portuguese, one on the mainland and one on the island. It took over 60 years to build these forts because the Portuguese went from a golden age to being ruled by Spain and then back to independence again. When Spain was ruling them, they had to halt construction on the fort. The 1755 earthquake destroyed both forts, and they've laid vacant ever since, but now they're national monuments. Also on the south side of Pessegueiro Island, there's a Roman archaeological site where they found several salting tanks. The Romans used to catch fish, and then they put them in salt tanks to preserve them longer, so that the fish could travel longer distances without spoiling. From there, we drove up to Sol Troia, which is where we picked up the Atlantic ferry. The ferries typically run every hour. We timed it so we got there about 20-25 minutes early. We had a nice 25-minute ride on the ferry, and then we were dropped off at Setúbal across the bay. From there was a short drive back to Lisbon, and our first stop was Torre Gebele, or with an English pronunciation, Belém Tower. The fortified tower was built in the 1500s at the very height of the Portuguese Golden Age. This is the very place where all the Portuguese explorers embarked and disembarked from their journeys around the world. And the line waiting to get in was about 2 hours long. I'll have to tour the inside on my next visit. This was our last full day in Portugal, so we just decided to spend the rest of the day exploring Lisbon without really a plan. Time Out Market was a really cool place. We got to see where Benfica plays soccer, and just casually walking the streets alive with people was just a very special moment for us. We had a very busy and ambitious itinerary with this trip because we wanted to get a taste of everything in Portugal, but I can't tell you how many stops I cut out of the itinerary before we even left, and how many places we did visit that I'd love to spend more time in. Hopefully you'll be able to use this video as a guide and pick the places that work best for you. If you have been to Portugal, drop me a comment and let me know what your favorite place is. If you haven't been, let me know where you're most excited to visit. And if you're in the Knights Templar, you know what to do. It's been a pleasure sharing my experience. Until next time.